Hi.
Okay. Hello.
Hi.
Welcome back to the Solutions Manual, episode 2. And
Yes, the
we're
first one was
talking,
very brief, very short, where we just introduced each other. And
yes,
I think this is going to be our first real podcast.
that's right. First real episode. And we are talking about burnout. Well, we're going to start talking about burnout.
Okay, and why? Maybe we should tell everyone why do we start with burnout?
hmm Well,
Okay, well, we will start talking about burnout because it's one of the most common problems that people reach out to us with. They ask for help. And we've uncovered this to be even bigger problem than we initially thought it is. And
hmm
it came on top of recent World's Mental Health Awareness Day,
hmm
which I believe was just less than 2 weeks ago,
hmm
which started a cascade of prompts, questions, and conversations. And we thought it would be a perfect topic for our first podcast. Oh, so listen, so in that conversation, it's completely okay to say just yes, it might not necessarily be something related to health or nutrition or exercising or those obvious things that make your life longer.
hmm
But there's this longevity theme. One, it could be taken literally, right, as your career longevity,
hmm
but it also has an impact on your overall quality of life
hmm
and a cascading impact on your not only quality of life but also how you live your life and what it leads to.
hmm
And we know that part of burnout is self-neglect, and we know that self-neglect what it means and why it's not really conducive, let's say, or it's not good for your overall health and long-term well-being.
I think another thing is in order for somebody to be able to start to even think about longevity, which requires a different perspective, right?
Hmm.
If you are experiencing or have a need to recover from burnout, like it's not possible to even put yourself in that long-term perspective in a meaningful way. You might not be fully aware, but you are really in this survival mode in some cases, hour by hour, day by day. So, of course, you cannot set or make long lasting changes in
Hmm.
your mindset if you are burnout does not allow for longevity, I think. So, I
I
think
think that's correct.
I think that's something we've observed as well. So, to help, hmm, so that's something you tackle first, right? Or address. Tackle might not be the right word, but yeah,
I think I agree, and I think we also have examples in our close circles, family and friends,
we do.
of people who suffered or are suffering from burnout.
Yes.
And you have your personal experience
Oh, I
of
didn't.
going through burnout as well, like first-hand experience.
Yes, I do.
So is this something that maybe we should talk about first?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, let's talk about it.
So tell me, how did that happen? What made young professional very early on in her career experiencing professional burnout?
hmm So, so burnout for me started just a few months into the pandemic. Leading up to that point, I was, I finished my doctorate. 2 weeks later, I started a new, I started my job in industry, my first job in industry. And I was
Mhm.
there for a year. I was very successful. I moved to a new role after a year that was in a different department, but for the same company. But it
Mhm.
meant more responsibility, much higher visibility projects, and I was supported and had a great team. And I was quickly promoted a year after that, which was early on in the pandemic. And the reason I say this is because while I was sort of really enjoying the success and learning new things and being able to be challenged and do all these different projects and do them well and be
Mhm.
recognized and be promoted rather fast, but it was also, it meant that it was difficult for someone like me to say no to projects, to be able to set
Mhm.
these healthy, let's say, work life boundaries. And when
Mhm.
the pandemic started, we were all virtual, and that meant just compensating for not being in person by being online longer. Like none of the projects went away. None of the expectations to meet them on time went away. So now we had to figure out ways to work um, to basically work as efficiently as possible, but virtually and deliver twice as much, if not more, work in that time. And by the way, I worked in vaccines, so that was not, we were considered essential
Essential workers at that time.
at that
Yeah.
time. So, so I think there was a combination of already being in a cycle of high performing, high achieving.
Mhm.
Um, I was, I enjoyed the work, but prioritizing and meeting expectations and maintaining work-life balance sort of, it wasn't, I ignored a lot of, let's say, yellow and red flags along
Mhm.
the way. So the work became the most important thing rather than my own health, my own fitness, my own sleep, all of that. Um, because I was being rewarded in other ways at work.
Mhm.
So so I think that's kind of where it started. I
Mhm.
had this personality of wanting to take on a lot of things and do them well,
Mhm.
but that meant that that just meant that my own health suffered greatly.
Okay. And how did your health suffer? What was the impact on your physical and emotional well-being?
Well, physical well-being suffered because I was working 80 hours a week, probably, and a lot of those hours were on the computer. So, some specific examples besides erratic eating, which didn't necessarily mean weight gain or loss, but it wasn't healthy eating. So all of my, like, not really giving my body what it needed to be able to function, which led to stress and my my mood changed. I wasn't sleeping well at all. I was constantly thinking about work. With all of the screen time, my my myopia became worse actually in both eyes. Eyes were much drier, a little bit of sleep deprivation over time. So those kinds of physical things. And then eventually being I stopped I stopped exercising entirely because I just didn't have the energy or I didn't think I had the time to do it,
Mhm.
which eventually led to um, replacing exercise. in the free time I had, replacing exercise or something that would be healthy outlets with not so healthy outlets.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so emotionally as well, it was, I didn't, we were all kind of not interacting with people the way we normally would. Anyone I would interact with would be colleagues, work colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I also had, well, how do I want to say that? Jeez. I was mostly interacting with my workmates because
Mm-hmm.
because we worked so much. But at that time, besides just work pressure, I really needed some extra support for my personal life, and I
Mm-hmm.
just wasn't seeking that. And
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't really maintaining connections with friends and family either. So that was, it all suffered.
Or reaching out for help, right?
Right.
And and how did it end? What was the final of this story?
So about 18 months into the first feelings that I had, or the first clues that I was maybe something was wrong physically, it was to the point that I would, I don't know if I even got REM for, who knows? I mean, sleep was so interrupted and so disturbed that I don't think I really could rest properly for maybe 6 months.
And REM, just for our listeners, we're referring to rapid eye movement phase of sleep,
Yes.
which will probably be a topic of another podcast. But
Yeah.
it's one of the phases of sleep that we go through, and one of
Yeah.
the phases of deep sleep, which is required for the proper brain function.
Yes. Thank you. And there are reasons for that, I think, in this
Mhm.
particular context. Um, so so that has certainly effects that though that can create other effects on its own.
Mhm.
Um, but it also physically was, I had, if I attempted to come back into exercise, and any form of exercise that required strength or resistance training, I couldn't even do it.
Couldn't even do it.
And that was so I looked like I could do it. I hadn't put on, it's not that I put on a lot of weight or something like that. I was so physically drained that I just couldn't do it, let alone teach it, which is very different for me. I would get a text message or an email, and I would know that I would be reading it, and I would be awake and reading it, but there was no comprehension whatsoever.
Mhm.
I told my management at the time that I thought I was experiencing burnout, and the
Mhm.
response was, "Oh, just take the day, or take the
Mhm.
weekend," or like that was, I was very concerned. And
Yes, like if that was a solution, right? Like if that could help. Mm.
yeah, I mean, if I thought that that would help, then I would, right? It was, so I was sort of aware that there was something really wrong, because I just couldn't, like, I couldn't write or read, and my job required me to write and
Mhm.
read every day. So
Yes.
um yeah, so that, how it ended after was I took a month off. So I took a vacation. I took a month off. I decided during that month that I was going to leave my job.
Mhm.
I had another opportunity set up, but I needed some time in between. So when I came back, and I didn't work or anything during that month, but I still couldn't rest, still couldn't
Mhm.
really taste food properly. Like, there was, my
Mhm.
mood was still very agitated. I was not, like, quite back
Mhm.
to being able to have normal interactions with people.
Mhm.
But when I came back, gave my 2 weeks notice, and I was going to give myself a couple of extra days before I was going to start a new role. And I was going to ease into it, and I was okay with that. And my body like basically shut down. My back spasmed. I had all sorts of issues with my muscles. It was like it wasn't, my body quite wasn't ready to be done with it and process it. And so I literally could not move for 5 days, let alone do any sort of work. So
very physical manifestation
yeah,
of burnout.
yes, and that eventually required some specific forms of counseling, some forms of massage therapy and physical therapy. I didn't take any medicines for this other than just pain management at that point because that's what it was. But yeah, I would say it took about 6 months
To recover.
to fully recover. And even then it's an ongoing, it needed to be an ongoing.
And it has physical consequences. It has financial consequences, right? Imagining being without an income for 6 months for many people is a huge source of stress.
Yes.
You talked about taking vacation, which is a very common mistake. We'll probably return to this in this conversation. That's what people believe they should do when they are experiencing burnout. It's an interesting story, but burnout, as you know, is one of the most commonly read manuals on our Substack,
Yeah.
and it's in a first paragraph. We write that 9 in 10 working Americans report experiencing burnout at some point in time in their career,
Yeah.
which I think is a staggering statistic, right? It's unbelievably high.
Yeah. Yeah.
Unbelievably high number. And I haven't personally experienced burnout ever, although I do have examples of people suffering from it in my immediate family. But I've never went through burnout. I believe it was because I have received some healthy advice very early on in my career. I used to have a clinical supervisor who used to stop people from working too hard. He used to say that if any of one burns out, he will advertise our opening, the opening for our position or our job if we quit on Monday. But our families will not be able to do that. And he also used to tell us that throughout the career span of a physician, we can help many more people if we pace ourselves, if we consider our working lifetime as a marathon rather than a sprint. We can continue, grow, learn, and help people for 20, 30, 40 years. But if we burn out after 2 or 3, we are very unlikely to return to work. And that was, I was living with this advice from very early on in my career, and that probably allowed me to build a lot of healthy habits in between to make sure it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
But going back to the numbers, we know that there's one very interesting statistic around this. Depending on a generation, the number of people reporting burnout changes dramatically. Like among people born in their 60s, it's roughly 1 in 5.
Right.
It's 1 in 3 among millennials, and it's more than 2 in 3 in Gen Zs. So why do you think, or why do we believe this is happening? There's a clear generational divide in how many people and how early experience burnouts in their professional or personal lives. So what could be driving this?
Well, one could be the approach to work, right? I think well, the approach to work after being in a certain type of educational system.
Hmm.
So I think people who are a little in the Gen Z are
Hmm.
their experience, their education is very different than those in their 60s, right? And there's
That's very
some,
true. Yes.
and in millennials, we even had this, we sort of divide. It's we kind of get this competitive honors classes,
Hmm.
APs, uh, experience, but for the most part, people then enter the workforce and depending on, but that competitive spirit sort of
Mm.
becomes individual, whereas with the Gen Z, that seems to be much more pervasive, and
Mm.
that's the prominent way of functioning and learning in
Mhm.
school, whereas I don't think that it existed with the older population in that way.
Well, we know it didn't exist, and that is true. That this very competitive approach to academic education starts very early on. I have children, some of them still in primary schools,
Hmm.
and this pressure
Hmm.
starts at very young age. I mean, here in the UK, as early as 5 years of age, children are often pressured for academic achievement very early on, and they are made aware
Mm.
that they are competing with their peers for grades, for places at universities, for placements in better schools or opportunities later on in life. And that, I believe, is definitely one of the reasons why when people later join the workforce, they're not starting competing when they're competent adults. They continue competing in a workplace after having competed for decades in
Right.
their primary, secondary, and higher education.
Hmm.
So,
Well, something we talked about recently with that
mm,
is one hypothesis would be, okay, if that's what you were exposed to for that long,
mm,
then haven't you developed the resilience to be able
mm,
to not just continue to remain competitive, but
yes,
protect yourself from the
mm,
potential for burnout or the mechanisms of burnout that can happen because of that. And that seems to not be true if the statistics still say that despite having been exposed to that kind of competition, the risk for burnout is still highest
I,
among the population. So what's why is that then?
it's a great question. I think there are multiple theories. One is, and I think you've mentioned this in your example, what happened during the pandemic is
Mm-hmm.
the blurring of the boundaries between personal and professional life. And historically, that was easy. You would show up at workplace at a certain time, let's say 9 a.m. You would leave the office, and everything with it at work were going back home.
Yeah, true.
Today, in the world where there's this connectedness or the illusion of connectedness between people, it's very easy to be constantly at work. Your phone that you use to get in touch with family is also used to answer work emails.
Right.
The notifications you're getting make it very difficult to separate your time that you spend working from the time you spend at home or out of work.
Hmm. Right.
And there's probably also something about the life expectations as well, which is clearly a differentiator between older and newer generations, where a lot of expectations about what success means is shaped by a certain social narrative that children and adults are exposed to all the time. It's very easy right now to compare ourselves to the lives of others. Of course, those are lives curated by social media and what let's say this illusion of connectedness I call, where you can look at others people's lives in a way that was never possible.
Hmm.
And humans have a tendency, natural tendency in a way, is to place themselves in some sort of a hierarchy and compare themselves to how are other people of similar backgrounds or similar age doing in life. compared to me, or use this as a benchmark of assessing our own success.
Right.
Previously, we would compare ourselves to our peers, people we work with, or our family.
Mm-hmm.
Now we are comparing ourselves to everyone in the world. But
Strangers.
we're also comparing ourselves to their curated personalities.
Right.
We only see a small fraction
Right.
of who those peoples are, and this lack of realistic life expectations probably contributes to this problem. So, Sarah, what is burnout? How do we define it? I know that there different people have a different definition of what it is. So let's start with one, right? How would you describe from your personal experience what burnout was?
Gosh. Oh. Oh. Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
How would I define what burnout was? Loss of control
Mm-hmm.
over the ability to make rational decisions, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
The awareness that the awareness of a type of exhaustion that makes
Mm-hmm.
it physically or emotionally difficult to function.
Mm-hmm. So we know that every person who goes to burnout will have their own personal
Worse.
experience with this. So
Yeah.
let's maybe try to put some systematic look at what burnout is.
Yeah.
Quite a while ago, it was classified as a disease. You could find it in the ICD-10, which is the international categorization of different conditions. It helps doctor to understand and code diseases.
Mm-hmm.
It
Mm-hmm.
used to have burnout used to be the Z73.0, which was defined by a certain set of factors. But the truth is, it no longer is considered as a medical condition. So the 11th revision of the ICD, of the International Classification of Diseases, no longer recognizes burnout as a disease. And this comes on top of development. As we learn more about what burnout is and isn't, we no longer consider this to be a medical condition. So burnout today is defined as a set of certain conditions which develop as a result of long-term exhaustion or extreme tiredness. And in other words, burnout is defined as a buildup of emotional pressure over time.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Again, I think the key word here is emotional pressure.
Mm-hmm.
Now, just because it's emotional pressure doesn't mean it doesn't have
Manifestation.
physical symptoms, because that continued buildup leads to, and again, we'll try to list them in the orders of how severe they are. It starts in a way that it's easy to ignore. You described certain red and yellow flags that you could have seen, but you didn't immediately attribute to the beginning of a burnout.
Mm-hmm.
Um, one of the first things that people sometimes notice in themselves is increased irritability or being easily annoyed, whether it is with coworkers or with yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's probably a consequence of persistent tiredness, of fatigue.
Right.
And I think all of us experienced this at some point in time, right? We had a longer day at work, or we didn't sleep at night, or we wake up sometimes when things are more difficult, travel, whatever that could be that disrupts our daily patterns.
Mm-hmm.
We sometimes feel that way. It's fairly normal, and that's probably why it's sometimes easy to ignore.
Yeah, sure.
Then the thing, as these things continue to build up and this tiredness continues, your sleep quality deteriorates and sleep duration deteriorates. Productivity over time will drop, and that starts to continue to add to the emotional pressure, which you described as, I'm young, I'm ambitious, I want to perform well in my job. But now you're starting to get into the cycle of a loop where where you cannot properly rest at night, and your productivity and therefore outputs at work go down. So in a situation where you try to prove yourself, that starts to add pressure to your life.
Right.
Right? You cannot properly rest. You want to be ambitious. You want to take more. You want to prove yourself to other people and to yourself. But you just got into the place where your body says, well, it's not going to be that easy.
Exactly.
It follows by difficulties concentrating and building up sleeping problems,
Mm-hmm.
typically at the beginning as a difficulty falling asleep first.
Mm-hmm.
Over time, it converts into difficulty not just falling asleep, but also staying asleep. So
Mm-hmm.
people would, even if they eventually managed to fall asleep, they would wake up repeatedly during the night. You said it yourself, right? Couldn't catch a single deep phase of sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And that cycle continues. It's going to have bigger impact on your work activities. It's going to start having bigger impacts on your personal relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And at a certain point in time, you start experiencing physical symptoms. And
Right.
they're at the beginning, in the beginning, those symptoms are simply consequences of fatigue and lack of sleep or sleep deprivation. It's
Mm-hmm.
like headaches or certain, let's say, gastrointestinal disturbance. It could be increased or decreased appetite. It could be muscle pains or joints. It could be susceptibility to infections or colds.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it will be followed by emotional dysregulation, so mood swings. And again, that's exacerbation of irritability. So essentially, you should see the pattern right now that those early symptoms start to increase in frequency and magnitude. Right? This irritability, and it becomes massive mood swings. You can go from laughing to crying for no apparent reason, and it
Mm-hmm.
just becomes more and more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Tiredness becomes exhaustion, up to the point that you have described as well, where you are no longer able to force yourself to work.
Right.
Even if it was something that you enjoyed and you were good at, it becomes impossible to force yourself to do that.
Right.
The reality is that we need to work. Most of us need to work. We have mortgages to pay. We have food we want to eat and bills we have to pay. And we start seeking shortcuts or short-term solutions to it. And at this stage, one of the most common patterns that we start seeing is looking for pharmaceutical shortcuts. By pharmaceuticals, I mean it could be prescription medicines that could, but rarely do help. It's substance abuse, and I think you've also described certain, dropping healthy habits and replacing them with those that were less, let's say, good for your long-term health.
Right.
And again, then that circle continues, and the mood swings become much more severe. Um,
And
it,
it's also this loss of willpower, right? Because
yes.
it's when you're choosing to do when you're choosing these interventions,
Hmm.
you're sort of aware that this is a very short-term thing, right? If
Yes.
maybe someone takes an extra melatonin, which won't
We
work,
know it. We know it won't work. Yes.
but you know that it's just to try and get yourself to maybe sleep that night,
Hmm.
but you're really just focused on the next 6 hours that you have, right? Or
You're
you're
not you're not fixing the problem, right? You're trying to fix the symptom rather than address the underlying issue.
I think most people, when they choose these kinds of things that you know are not really beneficial to you, short term or long term, there's
Hmm.
also this, you're not able to have the will to
Correct.
to say, okay, well then I'm not going to do this. So there's also
Hmm.
this, that's that decision making power that you lose, right? And then, like you said, it compounds, and then that becomes your new behavior.
It does. It does, and because that becomes the only thing that sustains you or prevents things from getting even worse, or at least it appears
It
to be.
appears, exactly.
Yes, because it doesn't. It's not really what happens. And then those
Right.
Changes in your emotional well-being become comparable, like you start feeling hopeless or worthless, which again will continue to add up to your emotional buildup, which will continue to deepen the burnout.
Mm-hmm.
Escapism, as we saw, the substance abuse, overeating, self-harm, self-sabotage, I think those things are fairly common at this stage of advanced burnout.
Mm-hmm.
And it ends up with complete disengagement and sometimes severe anxiety or panic attacks. People experience them too. They often end up in physicians' offices, and they go to see their doctors, their GP, their psychiatrists. They
Mm-hmm.
get prescribed medicines to manage those symptoms, but then again, they're not solving the problem,
Mm-hmm.
and it doesn't really take people to the right place. For many, it also leads to suicidal ideation or thoughts, and that now is a medical emergency,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately. And so burnout, despite not being a disease, leads to a series of significant symptoms and later other conditions that, if they are managed independently, um, essentially become a symptomatic treatment. They do not address the root cause of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what is important here to say, and that was your experience as well, that burnout doesn't happen immediately. It's not something. It's not like a heart attack.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like breaking a bone, right? It happens over time. So how long was this early stage of burnout? How was that going for you? How long did it last?
The early stage or
Yes, the early stages, like that you now know you've ignored, but the how long was that process?
probably six
Was it
months,
weeks? Or was it
months, probably.
months?
Yeah, months, right? Retrospectively, it's easy to say that though, right? To
Mm.
really look back and separate what was just a Friday night
Hmm.
reset versus a a Friday night that maybe was indicative of something needed to be addressed early on.
Hmm.
Just as an example, it could be anything, but I think it was slowly over 6 months for me. Now I know people in similar fields in under similar pressure at that time that it took half the time
Hmm.
for them to develop things, for them to move past that initial stage of, well, I guess half the time for them to reach a stage of self-neglect.
Hmm.
And then other people who are just now, 4 years later, realizing that they're they need some help now. So I think everybody is different and but it all leads to essentially the same place as you've described. And whether someone's aware of that or not during or after also depends on the person and their environment. But uh yeah, for me it was like 6 months.
Hmm. So you've used this word self-neglect.
Hmm.
We like this place, this spot on the journey to
Right.
burnout,
That's right.
because we consider this to be the point of no return.
Right.
But it's also a very easy symptom to spot, and it should be. This is probably what we would like all the readers and listeners to our podcast or readers of our manual to understand that if you reach the point where you have, for whatever reason, when you start to neglect yourself, like your own health, your needs,
Hmm.
it is your last red flag that something is really, really wrong. And if you ignore this stage, it will be very difficult it will be very difficult to get out of this. And one of the reasons, and you talked about this in your experience as well, is that in order to cope with this, then psychologically, the next thing that happens is people start to change their values to justify the things that they're doing, to justify what they need to continue to increase their workload,
Right.
to maintain, whether it's to maintain the work that they're doing or the perceived reputation that they might have or whatever those things might be.
Right.
Self-neglect is the last warning sign
Right.
where you should probably urgently seek someone who can help you dig yourself out of that spiral.
Right. Right.
And we have those in our manual on our web pages. You can read and learn about the stages of burnouts. But it's very important. This one is the one we would like people to understand and recognize.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also easy to spot, and you cannot mistake it for anything else.
That's
Right?
right.
The moment you start self-sabotaging or the moment you start caring for yourself is a bad moment. And we also know it's a bad moment because if you don't care about yourself or you are unable to care of yourself, it's also very difficult to care about others, whether it will be your coworkers or your team at work or your family.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We know that I've learned that during the surgical training as well. But the first thing that when you arrive to a site, let's say of an accident, the first thing is before you secure the site and people, you first make sure you're safe. It's the same if you ever travel on a plane. You've heard that many times, right? You put your own oxygen mask first
Mm-hmm.
before you try to help other people.
Mm-hmm.
So this red flag that we just talked about, this self-neglect, is like not putting the mask on yourself,
Mm-hmm.
but while still trying to help everyone around,
Right. Right.
right? You will not be able to help many people. You will fail to help yourself. You will soon need help from someone else. You will take someone else's resources to help you. You'll essentially become a problem for the crew that is trying to manage an emergency situation because you have failed to take care of yourself. And I like this example because it's like analogous to what burnout is to people around you, right? People at work, people at home. Um, So
Well,
before we go to the things that, because there's a way out, right? I mean, there are things you can do to help.
mhm. Well, but
Let's
let's just be clear though that by asking yourself or someone you care about whether they are really honest about that stage of self-neglect, yes, it is the red flag that makes it difficult.
Mhm.
But it's also a good thing to once you realize it or once you recognize it in someone else because
Mhm.
then there are things that you can do at that point
Yes.
and later, at any point. But if you recognize it at that point, that's a good thing too. So
Mhm.
I don't want people to think that they're in that stage 3 or later,
Mhm.
like, oh no, it's too late, or like it's never too late. It just
Correct.
means that the type of intervention or the type of solutions that you're going to need to get out of that will be different. But it doesn't mean,
Yes.
but the most,
And your journey will be longer as well.
yes,
So the
yes,
recovery will take.
longer.
Yes.
But it's important first to just be aware and honest about where you are and
Mhm.
then accept it and get help.
Right. And this the burnout is recognized by WHO, the World Health Organization, as a significant condition, as a mental health condition
Mhm.
that has a severe economic impact as well. So it's something that the employers, at least now, are becoming more aware of, or at least they should be, because the cost to the organizations of people burning out is quite significant. I think it's estimated to be over 5 trillion by the year 2030 globally, and the burnout contributes to a significant chunk of this of that money. It's actually quite well quantified. We provide the details in our manual. But the approaches that the employers take to preventing burnout in employees are not necessarily, well, we know that they are not necessarily helpful in many circumstances. I think the one that they, which again, this is something you did as well, is people think that, oh, I need to take a vacation. And we know that this is not the right way to go. Vacation is actually adds to the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Because if burnout is a buildup of emotional pressure, vacation actually adds fuel to the fire.
That's right.
Think about this. Like if you're planning to go somewhere else to a new environment, you need to get the plane tickets, make sure you get there on time, find an accommodation, the food's going to be different, weather's going to be different, all those things. That type of experience is enjoyable if you have energy to handle it.
Right.
But if you're already burned out, everything that adds additional pressure, there's another thing you need to do, another thing you need to take care of, another thing you need to plan, think about, make sure things go right. They actually make things worse.
Right. I mean, the vacation I took was essentially a package. It's sort of equivalent to how people might go on a cruise, but you still have
Mm-hmm.
to find your way to the airport, pack your bags, like every little thing, even if the trip itself is
Full
inclusive,
happiness, yeah.
let's say,
Mm.
all of these little things will add to that list that is already way over.
Yes, and I think that's another thing we would like to everyone to fully understand that adding additional pressure on yourself
Hmm.
is not something that will help you recover from a burnout. It's just simply not the way to go. So I think that everyone should be very mindful that if you are in that situation, the path to recovery doesn't lead through taking additional, um, let's say, responsibilities or difficulties upon yourself. And vacation is a great thing to do if you're otherwise well. Yes, you work hard, you reward yourself, you go, you take a break, you rest. It's fine. It's a very different story if you're already burning out.
Right.
It is very likely to make things worse. So what what can we do to address burnout?
Yeah. I mean, I think one step is to provide some reassurance first that it will end,
Mm.
but it will take time and it will require small steps. This is not I have a deadline, I have to do this next month.
Mhm.
First, it needs to be this acceptance that you will not be able to continue doing what you're doing and recover at the same time. So that's hard for people because they do have busy calendars and lives and things they want to
Mhm.
accomplish. And one is to know that you can still be successful and accomplish those things, whatever you want, but
Mhm.
not in the current state. And that requires a type of slowing down and
Mhm.
replacing some behaviors or some thoughts
Yes,
rather than just completely stopping them altogether either.
absolutely. And I think you're raising a very important point because we know that the older generations typically suffered from burnout less, but
Yeah,
it doesn't mean they worked less hard.
right,
Actually, the opposite is true.
right,
The older generations typically worked much harder, both in terms of time spent at work. There was
right,
no such thing as work-life balance.
right.
The work was often physically much more demanding.
Hmm.
So it's not how hard you work that makes you burn out. I think that's another thing that people often believe that, oh, I just need to work less hard or I need that's not necessarily
Hmm.
synonymous. You can still work hard and contribute and be successful in your career without risking burning out. You just need to know how to do that.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
Again, we can learn from people who have lived in a post-war or were born in a post-war era, and learn how they have built their mental and physical resilience as they went through employment.
Mm-hmm.
Also simplicity, right? Embracing or being able to design your life in a way
Right.
that allows for fewer choices and
Right.
less pressure. And a lot of those things are doable if you know how.
Yeah.
You don't have to necessarily do less. I think a great example is sometimes very simple things that reduce the decision fatigue or drain on your mental resources. It's bundling things up together, right? If you keep your gym bag packed and ready to go next to your shoes or next to your exercise equipment, it will be easier to do certain things, right? So building and creating certain habits and routines
Mm-hmm.
around your work that take decision making out of your life every day help, right? And there are ways to cleverly design them
Yes.
based on your individual circumstances so that you don't arrive to work already exhausted, right? Because you needed to manage the crisis at home, you feed the children, do the unanswered email, right? After after not
Working
sleeping
and not sleeping. Yeah.
at nights, waking up already angry and tired, and by the time you get off the car at work,
Mm-hmm.
it's already too much,
Yeah.
right? So designing the life around you in a specific way um, helps, but we say it frequently. It's simple but not easy,
Mm-hmm. That's right.
and if you knew how to do that correctly, you probably wouldn't burn out, right? If you knew this from the outset how to do that, you wouldn't burn out.
Right.
Um, Anything else that we believe is important or that we can learn from the older generation? I know there are bits that are relevant to burnout, like being able to delay gratification or
Mm.
build more stronger social connections, right? Not in their number, but in quality
Mm-hmm.
are important, right? And that requires certain sacrifices, I would say, or at least something that appears to be a sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it isn't. And also a change in mindset, right? It's this being a little bit, allowing yourself to be a little bit more selfish
In a way, yeah.
in a way, like you're putting the mask, right? The oxygen mask first on yourself
Yeah.
is a good thing to do, right? I mean, it doesn't make you a bad person if you, or a bad parent, or a bad worker, or a bad manager,
Mm-hmm.
if you think about yourself first.
Mm-hmm. Right. It makes you a more effective one.
And it
I
makes you
think,
less likely to burn out as well.
well, right. I think
Yeah.
you alluded to this earlier, but the separation of work and life, approximately that was much easier, especially before the last
Yes.
5 years, where you go to work, there's a commute that is designed to force that separation in a way so that
Mhm.
you can, by the time you get home,
Mhm.
your identity that is attached to your work is is clearly
Yes.
not part of your home life. So the issue I think with it's difficult to do now virtually, the virtual workforce, I get that. And there's things that you can do to help create that separation. But
Mhm.
I think for
Absolutely.
people in especially the younger generation of people,
Mhm.
it's not just about your identity of work and being able to separate. It's your sense of validation that comes from
Mhm.
now work. So like taking a really hard look, and that's very difficult to do on your own as well, I think.
Mhm.
But it's not just about being able to shut it down or put it away and not think about it, or because that's not really reasonable, but ask
Mhm.
yourself, is the performance I am delivering at work do I am I more valued, right?
Mhm.
That's very extrinsic. That's very heavily based on external validation,
Mhm.
comes from the inability to separate that work and life. So
Mhm.
doesn't mean that there's plenty of things for us to value for ourselves internally. So redefining what those are and how to meet those. So I think it sort of goes with that selfishness as well as
Mhm.
reframing your value of your own self that doesn't depend on work or output
Absolutely.
is important. And that's kind of later to do when you're recovering, I think, from
Mhm.
burnout or even just general challenges with relationships too. It's like
Mhm.
to take a step back and say, okay, well, do I value myself because of the quality of the report I put out,
Mhm.
or did I treat my partner well today? Did,
Mhm.
versus did I take care of myself? What are you doing
Mhm.
for yourself? So I think that's really another thing for people to start thinking about is where are you feeding your own
Mhm.
value? And if it's
Yes,
external or dependent on work, that's a different conversation.
it is. And the self-value and prioritizing your values and recognizing your own self-worth. There are tools to address and fix those things, but they do require a lot of guidance and a lot of work
Mhm.
to get there. So,
Mhm.
because so far we've been talking about how to recover from burnout, but there are also things that you could or should be thinking about if you want to prevent it. Right? If you think about yourself as someone who needs to spend another 10, 20, 30, 40 years in a career or in a profession or making a living,
Mhm.
being able you can sustain yourself through that time becomes extremely, extremely important. And
Mhm.
one of the things that people sometimes or not readily think about is that you peak cognitively and physically roughly in your mid 20s,
Mhm.
and your body continues to decline both in terms of its strength and ability to cope with the external demands slowly, and there are ways to slow that process down. But you need to be aware of the fact that you will be far less productive 30 years from now or 20 years from now than you are today. But
Mhm.
you will be very likely, due to your increased experience or time spent in a profession, you will be expected to deliver more and more.
Mhm.
So you need to come up with clever ways
Yeah.
and sustainable ways to make sure you can maintain that performance or
Mhm.
actually increase that performance
Mhm.
while your physical and cognitive abilities decline. And that's a challenge as well that
Right.
needs to be carefully planned and managed, especially if you think about or identify yourself with your career or you're ambitious and you want to achieve or continue to achieve for the next 10, 20, 30 years, right? So building those habits and this capital of reserves, cognitive and physical reserves early on
Mhm.
is very, very important, right? I mean, that's part of what we do with people. We work with primarily with people who want to maintain their capacity to continue to perform throughout their professional career.
Well, that's the
Um,
longevity mindset.
that's the longevity mindset. Absolutely.
Mhm.
Yes.
And it's possible.
It is possible and it's doable
And
and
it
it's evidence
and it works. Yeah.
and it works. Right.
Yeah. Shall we recap?
Let's.
Well, so burnout, widespread problem,
Correct.
defined as an emotional buildup, used to be part of the ICD-10 index as an actual disease, but now is isn't taken off the list, but still remains recognized by the WHO as a huge problem. It affects people. It affects people of all ages, but what we're finding in the workforce is that the Gen Z generation and millennials seem to be impacted, or the risk of developing burnout seems to be higher in Gen Z and millennials than what we've observed in older generation. And
disproportionately,
right. And there are some reasons for that, possibly. There are a few stages of burnout that that we use to define not just where someone perceives themselves, but also objectively, if they are experiencing those phases, how best to help them, which still comes down to an individual's lifestyle, tendencies, the history that they have, and where they want to go. But those stages are important in identifying that, and of particular importance, that kind of point of no return, or past the point where now you really need help, is the stage of self-neglect. So if someone stops taking care of themselves, then, and they're honest about where they are in that burnout phase, then that's a hard thing to experience. It probably means you've been neglecting yourself for a while, but that also means that it's possible to come back and recover and be and not experience this again.
Absolutely. The moment you recognize where you are and where you're heading to is a good thing, because now you know what the next steps could or should be.
That's right.
Yes.
And self-neglect also means that it's almost impossible to really take care of the people around you the way that either you would want to or that they need. So the analogy being the oxygen mask falling from the airplane. There's a reason why you put the mask on yourself first before you put it on others, even if they are small children, old, it doesn't matter. You put the mask on yourself first. There are things that people can do to start to address their own experience in burnout. And some of that is is awareness and acceptance of where they are, making things in their daily lives easier to initially cope with without completely stopping. So we don't ever recommend taking a long vacation and trying to get rest. That's really not, biologically and physiologically speaking, that's not really going to do that. That actually makes it worse. That adds to the emotional buildup. So if somebody who is experiencing this and is looking for the next steps, the immediate next steps, well, one is to get help from people, from a professional, or professionals who have expertise in burnout and recovery, and not just because of their own experience, but actual accredited experience in how to manage this and how to help, and also reprioritizing yourselves, taking small steps towards breaking down little goals that you can do.
Absolutely. And I think when it comes to seeking for help, not everyone can always find or afford professional help. But it's important to ask for anyone who potentially can help you. It could be a friend or family. They can sometimes provide a framework that can help, even if it's not the most optimal or the best way to handle this. It's still better than doing nothing or trying to handle this by yourself.
Mhm.
Asking, sometimes asking a healthcare professional, you know, going to your doctor or a physician could be a way to go. Although we know that there's a risk of medicalizing
Mhm.
burnout and trying to treat symptoms of ongoing burnouts with pharmaceuticals. And again, that could be a good supportive solution, but it's not necessarily addressing the root cause of the problem. And it's not building habits that could prevent you from developing or going into burnout again in the future.
Mhm.
So, but yes, by all means, ask for help. I think we would highly recommend to anyone who experiences burnout
Mhm.
not to try to go through this
Oh, yeah.
themselves. Yeah,
Right. Right.
great. Okay, thank you, Sarah. That's a great recap. I hope we have clicked recording at the beginning of this conversation.
I think so.
Yes, it wouldn't be the first time where we didn't. And I think it's a good introduction to burnouts. I believe it's likely we'll be going back to this topic, especially when people will be as people will be reaching out to us. Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is this how you want to end it?
Well, I think that's a great question. So maybe we should end with telling people what's next.
Yeah, what's next?
Hmm.
Well, we'll probably well, you said we'll probably continue this conversation.
Hmm.
Burnout is complex, complicated,
Hmm.
deserves a lot more discussion.
Hmm.
Um, shall we link the page of the solutions manual on burnout?
Yes, absolutely. Which we will.
It's a good
Should
read
yes.
and a
We'll
reread.
make. I think
Recommend.
it should appear if you're watching this on video. It should appear um, on the screen, right? We can put the link to the video on the screen.
Oh, on the screen, yes. Okay.
Yes, we can do that,
Yes, yes. Yeah.
and we put it in the notes or description
Hmm.
below in the show notes as well, so you can click, explore, read, um,
And ask questions.
ask questions. Yes, there's comment sections. There are links you can click and learn more about, and over time we will. Yeah, we'll keep expanding, responding to your questions as well.
So we'll continue this conversation
Hmm.
and I don't
Next
know.
week,
Next
hopefully
week?
next week, maybe next week, or yeah, maybe in our next episode.
Yeah. I think we should continue this next. We should do a part two.
Hmm. Absolutely. So thank you, Sarah, for sharing your personal experience. Thank you. I think we should thank everyone who actually managed to stay with us until the end of this conversation.
Yes,
And
thank
yes,
you.
we hope that you will join us next time.
Yes, more solutions in part two.
Thank you.
Speak soon. For a second.
Of course.
No, no, just stay where you are. Like, stay in that position.
Mhm.
Okay. I like the way that you tell the story about um the 50%. The way
Mhm.
you said it in this was different, but the way you've said it in the past a couple times is flows better. Like, can you just tell that story?
50%.
The advice that you've received early
Mhm.
on in your career
Mhm.
around not burning out. Like,
Mhm.
tell me that story again.
So uh, this was one of my clinical supervisors in my medical training. He used to say, he used to yell at anyone
Mm-hmm.
who would say, suggest, or behave as if they were giving 100% of their capacity at work.
Mm-hmm.
Which was interesting to a young doctor who tries to be, ambitious and prove himself,
Of course.
to hear, why would you work less than you're capable of? And this was introducing certain perspective, which I wouldn't normally consider, the time perspective. If I will do 100%, if I will give 100% of what I am capable of today and tomorrow, and for the next year, 2 or 5, I was told I will eventually burn out.
Mm-hmm.
And if this will lead, as it often does, to people abandoning their career or quitting or moving to do something completely different, or in significant detriment to health or suicide, as we know that sometimes ends, and especially among males, that's not the best use of my medical skills and knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I will help a certain amount of patients before I burned out. But if I could reduce the pressure that I put on myself and work at 75 or even 50%, but I will be able to maintain this pace for another 20, 30, or 40 years, I will help many more people over this period of time. And I will be also able to help them better because I will be in a better physical and mental shape, and I will know more. But medicine is one of those professions that accumulate experience and knowledge over time.
Mm-hmm.
So if a physician is committed to continuous learning, they increase their ability, their knowledge and experience as they get older.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that was a very interesting perspective. That was a very interesting way to think about the longevity of employment or longevity of a career by incorporating the time element into my today's day. Right? It's not just what I do today. It's what I will need to be consistently doing for the next 20, 30, 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
That changes how I think about today.
Mm-hmm.
Because that simple time shift, that simple reframing of what I need to do today now also means, what do I need to do today to be able to do this just as well a decade from now?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it changes the way you think about what you need or must do today at work. Because part of your responsibility for yourself is now taking time and care for yourself so you can continue doing this for a long time.
Right.
Yes. So again, it took me a while to fully understand the depth of that advice and the anger of the much more experienced doctor at that time, why I shouldn't be giving everything I have at work. Um, I think I think it was one of those things that, upon reflection, led me or allowed me to build habits that allowed me so far to avoid burning out at work.
Mm-hmm. And if someone burned out in that team, what did he say?
Nobody did.
Nobody did.
No, because again, he was actively
Mm-hmm. Preventing.
discouraging people
Mm-hmm.
to be too competitive,
Mm-hmm.
to trying to be better than the person right next to you, or trying to compete with yourself in that way.
Mm-hmm.
It was more about sustaining yourself,
Mm-hmm.
and because that what will make you better over time.
And the other perspective he gave you was not just time, but family.
Yes, so that was the other part of the other thing they used to say is that if something happens to you, or you're burned out, or something else happens to you, and you will not show up at work on Friday, he used to say, well, I will advertise the opening for your position on Monday, but your family will not be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So to keep the perspective, keep in mind what matters, what is more important, which bits are and are irreplaceable. What is your role in a healthcare system, and what is your role in your family or in your immediate circle of relationships. I think that was quite a powerful way to say it. It was also true.
It's also true, right?